6:35 a.m., December 11th, 1941. The narrow channel between Wake and Wilkes Islands. Approximately 800 yards offshore, 6 Japanese destroyers and 3 light cruisers steam toward the beach in attack formation. Behind the coral ridge overlooking the southern shore, Marine gunners track the approaching warships through optical sights mounted on coastal defense guns that were once the main batteries of scrapped battleships. 4,000 yards, 3,500 yards, 3,000 yards, close enough to see the rising sun flags snapping in the wind, close enough to count gun turrets, close enough for the Japanese cruiser Yubari to open fire, her shells screaming overhead to detonate harmlessly in the jungle behind Marine positions. Every instinct scream to return fire. Every manual says engage at maximum effective range. Every naval gunner knows you never let enemy warships close to point-blank range without firing. But this morning, the Marines hold their fire. This morning, they are following orders from a major who has bet everything on a single calculation. If the Japanese get closer, his obsolete 5-inch guns might sink warships. If the Japanese get closer, his 449 Marines might survive a day that should end in their annihilation. The Japanese believe they are about to land troops on another lightly defended Pacific atoll. They have no idea they are steaming into the only battle in the entire Second World War where shore batteries will turn back an amphibious invasion force. Sometimes letting your enemy get dangerously close is not desperation, it is mathematics. If you are enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Major James Patrick Sinnott Devereux stood in his command post on Wake Island and contemplated a problem that had no good answer. It was December 4th, 1941. And every intelligence estimate said war with Japan was coming within days, perhaps hours. His position was militarily absurd, a garrison force that was about 1/3 the size required to defend what he had been ordered to defend. The numbers were brutal and simple. Wake Island consisted of 3 coral islets arranged in a rough V shape, covering barely 2.5 square miles of sand, scrub brush, and jagged coral. The atoll sat 2,300 miles west of Pearl Harbor, 600 miles north of the Japanese-held Marshall Islands. It was one of the loneliest pieces of real estate in the Pacific, valuable only because it had a lagoon that could accommodate seaplanes and enough flat ground for an airstrip. Devereux commanded the Wake Island Detachment of the 1st Marine Defense Battalion, 422 enlisted Marines and 27 officers. His heavy weapons consisted of 6 5-inch coastal defense guns, 12 3-inch anti-aircraft guns, 18 50 caliber machine guns, and 30 30 caliber machine guns. The 5-inch guns had been pulled from scrapped battleships and installed in open concrete emplacements with minimal protection. No gun turrets, no armored shields, just the barrels pointing out over the ocean and crews that would be completely exposed to enemy fire. Marine Corps doctrine stated that proper defense of an atoll, the size of Wake, required at least 1,500 men, radar equipment for early warning, and enough ammunition stockpiled to sustain prolonged combat. Devereux had less than 1/3 of the required manpower, no radar, and ammunition supplies that would run out after a few days of serious fighting. The strategic situation made the tactical situation worse. Wake Island existed to serve as a forward operating base for submarines and patrol aircraft. It was a stepping stone between Hawaii and the Philippines, meant to extend American power across the Central Pacific. But, in early December 1941, that strategy was already becoming obsolete. Japanese forces controlled most of the islands between Wake and the Philippines. The atoll was not a forward base. It was an isolated outpost surrounded by enemy territory. Devereux had arrived on Wake October 12, 1941, and immediately began working his Marines 16 hours a day, 7 days a week. They dug gun emplacements into coral so hard it dulled pickaxes. They strung barbed wire around potential landing beaches. They stockpiled ammunition and built overhead cover for command posts. The work was brutal, and Devereux drove his men without mercy because he understood that preparation was the only advantage they had. His Marines detested him for it. They called him by his initials JPS, which they claimed stood for just plain shit. He was demanding, inflexible, and seemingly incapable of sympathy for men who were already exhausted from months of construction work in the tropical heat. But Devereux had spent 16 years in the Marine Corps learning how to defend fixed positions, and he knew what happened to undermanned garrisons when the enemy attacked in force. Alongside the Marines, more than 1,100 civilian contractors worked for Morrison Knudsen Company, improving the airfield and building permanent facilities. They were construction workers, not soldiers, but they were Americans, which meant they would become targets the moment war began. Devereux could not evacuate them. He could not protect them adequately. He could only hope that when the attack came, enough of them would survive to help fight. The strategic value of Wake Island was obvious to everyone who looked at a map of the Pacific. Pan American Airways had been using the atoll as a refueling stop for trans-Pacific Clipper flights since 1935. The presence of a commercial aviation facility in the middle of the ocean demonstrated exactly why military planners wanted a base there. Control Wake, and you controlled air and sea routes across thousands of miles of otherwise empty ocean. The Japanese understood this as clearly as the Americans did. Intelligence reports indicated that Japanese planners viewed Wake as a threat to their operations in the Marshall Islands. An American bomber base on Wake could strike Japanese facilities 600 miles to the south. More critically, holding Wake demonstrated American commitment to maintaining a presence in the Central Pacific, even as Japanese forces swept through Southeast Asia and the Philippines. The defense plan Devereux developed was based on a simple premise. He could not prevent a Japanese landing. He lacked the firepower, the manpower, and the mobility to defend 3 separate islets against a determined amphibious assault. But he could make the Japanese pay such a high price for landing that they might withdraw rather than accept the casualties. The key to this strategy was his 6 5-inch coastal defense guns. These weapons had been manufactured in the early 1900s and removed from obsolete battleships during scrapping operations. Each gun could fire a 54-pound shell to a maximum range of 15,000 yards. They were not modern weapons. They lacked fire control computers, power-assisted training mechanisms, or sophisticated sighting equipment, but they were large enough to damage warships if they could get close enough to hit them. Devereux positioned the guns in 3 batteries of 2 guns each. Battery A on Peacock Point at the southern tip of Wake Island proper, Battery B on Peel Island to the north, Battery L on Wilkes Island to the southwest. Each battery was commanded by a lieutenant who had been trained as an artilleryman, but who now faced the prospect of fighting the first naval surface action any of them had ever experienced. The critical limitation of the 5-inch guns was range. Modern Japanese cruisers mounted 6-inch guns that could engage targets at 20,000 yards or more. Japanese destroyers carried 5-inch guns comparable to the American weapons, but mounted in powered turrets that could traverse and elevate faster than the manually operated American emplacements. In a long-range gunnery duel, the Japanese would destroy Devereux's batteries before the Marines could inflict serious damage. This meant the defense plan required accepting a psychologically unbearable condition. The Marine gunners would have to watch enemy warships approach, see them open fire, take casualties from Japanese shells, and hold their own fire until the enemy was close enough that even obsolete weapons with basic sighting equipment could achieve hits. The range for this kind of shooting was 4,000 to 5,000 yards, close enough that junior officers with limited training could direct fire using optical sights and achieve reasonable accuracy. Holding fire until enemy ships closed to that range meant accepting that some Marines would die from Japanese bombardment before they could shoot back. It meant watching shells land around your position and knowing you had weapons that could engage the enemy but were under orders not to fire. The psychological pressure of passive defense under fire was something no training manual could prepare men to handle. Lieutenant Clarence Barninger commanded Battery A on Peacock Point. His 2 5-inch guns were positioned to cover the southern approaches to Wake Island, the most likely avenue for a Japanese assault. Barninger was 26 years old, a career Marine who had joined the Corps in 1936. He had trained on coastal defense weapons at Quantico and understood the theory of shore bombardment. He had never fired at a moving warship. Lieutenant John McAllister commanded Battery L on Wilkes Island. His position covered the western approaches and the channel between Wilkes and Wake. McAllister had trained as an artilleryman but spent most of his career with infantry units. He was learning coastal defense tactics on the job, studying manuals and conducting practice drills with his gun crews during the few hours between construction work shifts. Lieutenant Woodrow Kessler commanded Battery B on Peel Island. His guns covered the northern approaches and could traverse to engage ships approaching from the east. Kessler understood that his battery would be the last line of defense if Japanese forces managed to land on Wake proper and advance toward the airfield. His two guns would have to engage targets at minimum range, firing over the heads of retreating Marines. The fire control system for the coastal defense guns was primitive by modern standards. Each battery had a battery commander, a plotting room team that calculated firing solutions, and gun crews that loaded and fired on command. The plotting room used basic trigonometry to convert observed ranges and bearings into gun elevation and azimuth settings. The system worked, but it was slow and required clear communication between observers and gun crews. Devereaux had no illusions about what would happen if the Japanese attacked with overwhelming force. His Marines would fight, they would inflict casualties, they would make the enemy pay for every yard of beach, and then they would be overrun because there were not enough of them to hold 3 separate islands against a determined assault by thousands of enemy troops supported by naval gunfire and airstrikes. The only question was whether they could make the cost high enough to matter, whether sinking 1 or 2 Japanese ships would force the enemy to reconsider, whether buying a few extra days would allow reinforcements to arrive from Pearl Harbor, whether dying well would count as victory when the strategic situation made survival impossible. The answer to all these questions depended on mathematics and discipline, on making every shell count because there were not enough shells to waste, on holding fire until every shot had a reasonable chance of hitting because there would not be time for ranging shots and corrections, on trusting that young Marines who had never been in combat would do the hardest thing soldiers ever have to do, stand under fire and wait for orders. Marine Fighting Squadron 211 had arrived on Wake December 4th, flying 12 Grumman F-4 F-3 Wildcat fighters from the aircraft carrier Enterprise. Major Paul Putnam commanded the squadron, a group of pilots so new to their aircraft that most had fewer than 10 hours flying time in the Wildcat. The planes themselves were virtually brand new, delivered without spare parts, without maintenance manuals, without the ground equipment needed to service them properly. The Wildcat was a stubby, pugnacious fighter that looked more like a barrel with wings than a sleek combat aircraft. It was slower than the Japanese Zero, less maneuverable, and equipped with less range, but it was ruggedly built, heavily armed with 6 50-caliber machine guns, and capable of taking damage that would destroy more fragile aircraft. In the hands of a skilled pilot, the Wildcat could hold its own against anything the Japanese flew. The problem was that VMF 211 did not have many skilled pilots. Most of the squadron had been trained as dive bomber pilots and only recently transitioned to fighters. They knew how to fly. They knew basic combat tactics. They did not know the Wildcat well enough to exploit its strengths or compensate for its weaknesses. And they were about to face Japanese pilots who had been fighting in China for years, men who had hundreds of combat hours and knew exactly how to kill inexperienced enemy aviators. Devereaux incorporated the fighters into his defense plan as best he could. 4 planes would be on patrol when the attack came, giving them a chance to intercept incoming bombers before they reached the island. The other 8 would be on the ground, dispersed around the airfield but vulnerable to the kind of precision bombing that Japanese aviators had demonstrated repeatedly in China and Malaya. Commander Winfield Scott Cunningham arrived on Wake November 28th to assume overall command of the island. Cunningham was a naval aviator, a career officer who had served in administrative positions for most of his time in uniform. He was not a combat commander. He was not trained in ground defense tactics. He was an experienced officer who understood logistics and coordination, assigned to command a forward base that was about to become a battlefield. The command relationship between Cunningham and Devereux was officially clear. Cunningham commanded the island, Devereux commanded the ground defences, but in practice, Devereux had been on Wake for 6 weeks, knew every gun position, knew every Marine, and had developed the tactical plans that would govern how the garrison fought. Cunningham was the senior officer, but Devereux was the man who would direct the battle. This arrangement would work well enough during the fighting that was coming. Cunningham would handle communications with Pearl Harbor, coordinate air operations, and manage the civilian population. Devereux would fight the battle. The division of responsibility was pragmatic and would allow both men to focus on what they did best. On December 7th, 1941, Wake Island time, word reached the atoll that Pearl Harbor had been attacked. The message came through military radio channels, brief and shocking. Japanese carrier aircraft had struck the Pacific Fleet at anchor. Casualties were heavy. The battleships Arizona, Oklahoma, California, West Virginia, and Nevada had been sunk or heavily damaged. Hundreds of aircraft destroyed on the ground. Thousands of Americans dead. For the Marines on Wake, the news meant that war had begun, and they were already behind enemy lines. The Japanese-held Marshall Islands were 600 miles south. Japanese bombers based at Roa could reach Wake in less than 4 hours. The atoll had no radar, no advance warning system, no way to detect incoming aircraft until they were visible on the horizon. The next Japanese attack could come at any moment. Devereux ordered all Marines to battle stations. The gun crews manned their positions. The anti-aircraft batteries prepared for air attack. VMF 211 put 4 Wildcats in the air on patrol, while ground crews prepared the other 8 aircraft for emergency launch. The civilian contractors were ordered to continue working because there was nothing else for them to do, and stopping construction would not make them any safer. 11:58 a.m. December 8th. 36 Japanese G-3M Nell medium bombers appeared over Wake Island, flying in precise formation at 15,000 feet. The attack had been timed to coincide with noon, when most of the garrison would be at lunch, but a rain squall and low cloud cover had delayed the bombers, allowing them to approach unseen and unheard until they were almost directly overhead. The 4 Wildcats on patrol were at 12,000 feet, below the bombers and unable to see them through the clouds. The 8 Wildcats on the ground were parked in neat rows near the airfield, their pilots and ground crews preparing for the midday meal. When the first bombs fell, there was no warning, no air raid siren, no time to scramble. The Japanese bombers executed their attack with the precision of men who had done this hundreds of times before in China. They flew in tight V formations, each group releasing their bombs in coordinated salvos that walked across the airfield in overlapping patterns. The 60-kilogram fragmentation bombs were designed specifically to destroy aircraft on the ground, and they achieved exactly what Japanese planners had intended. 8 Wildcats were destroyed in the first minutes of the raid. Some exploded as bombs detonated near their fuel tanks. Others were shredded by bomb fragments that tore through wings and fuselages. The machine shops and maintenance facilities near the airfield were demolished. 23 Marines were killed, most of them aviation personnel who had been working on the aircraft. 11 more were wounded. The anti-aircraft batteries opened fire as soon as the bombers appeared, but hitting aircraft at 15,000 feet with 3-inch guns was almost impossible. The Japanese formation was too high, too fast, and too well coordinated. They dropped their bombs, reformed, and departed without losing a single aircraft. When the attack ended, VMF 211 had been reduced from 12 aircraft to 4 operational fighters. The squadron had lost 2/3 of its combat strength in 15 minutes. Worse, many of the mechanics and armourers who kept the planes flying were among the casualties. The surviving aircraft would have to be maintained by pilots and whoever else could learn basic maintenance procedures quickly enough to keep the Wildcats operational. Devereux surveyed the damage and understood immediately that the situation had become even more desperate than he had anticipated. The Japanese had demonstrated that they could strike Wake at will. They would return daily, systematically destroying what remained of the American defensive capability. Without effective air defense, the coastal guns would eventually be knocked out by precision bombing. Without the coastal guns, Japanese ships could bombard the island with impunity before landing troops to capture what remained. The mathematics of attrition were simple and brutal. Every day, the garrison would become weaker. Every air raid would destroy more guns, kill more Marines, reduce the defensive capability. The only question was whether help would arrive from Pearl Harbor before the attrition reached the point where defense became impossible. Major Putnam gathered his surviving pilots and delivered orders that would have seemed absurd under different circumstances. 4 Wildcats would fly continuous patrols from dawn to dusk, 2 aircraft airborne at all times, while the other 2 were refueled and rearmed. The pilots would work in shifts, flying multiple sorties per day, sleeping when they could, and knowing that mechanical failure or combat damage would reduce their numbers until none remained. The ground crews would cannibalize the destroyed aircraft for spare parts. They would repair battle damage using whatever materials they could scrounge from the civilian contractors. They would keep the surviving Wildcats flying through improvisation, determination, and the kind of inspired mechanical work that would have impressed professional aircraft mechanics, but which would have horrified safety inspectors. The civilian contractors responded to the bombing with remarkable resilience. More than 180 of them volunteered to fight alongside the Marines. They would man machine guns, serve as stretcher bearers, deliver ammunition to gun positions, and do whatever else was needed to defend the island. The others would continue construction work, repairing bomb damage, building new fortifications, and maintaining the infrastructure that kept the garrison functioning. This was not the role they had signed up for when they took construction jobs in the Pacific. They were civilians, not soldiers. They had families back home who expected them to return when their contracts ended. But they were Americans on an American island, and when the attack came, they made the same choice that soldiers make. They stayed and fought because leaving was not possible, and surrender was not acceptable. December 9th and 10th brought more Japanese air raids. The bombers returned on schedule, demonstrating that Wake had become part of their regular target rotation. Each raid followed the same pattern. 30 to 40 bombers flying in formation at 15,000 feet, dropping their ordnance with practiced precision and departing before the surviving Wildcats could intercept them effectively. The anti-aircraft batteries fired at every raid, but the 3-inch guns were fundamentally inadequate for engaging bombers at that altitude. The best the gunners could hope for was to force the Japanese to fly higher or break formation, reducing the accuracy of their bombing. They succeeded in this limited objective, but they could not prevent the systematic destruction of facilities across the island. VMF 211 managed to shoot down 2 Japanese bombers during this period, demonstrating that even 4 Wildcats could inflict casualties when they caught the enemy formations at the right angle and altitude. But the cost was severe. 1 Wildcat was shot down, its pilot killed. The others sustained combat damage that required extensive repairs. By December 10th, VMF 211 was down to 4 operational aircraft, and those 4 were held together by improvised repairs and the determination of men who refused to accept that their situation was hopeless. Devereaux used the days between December 8th and December 11th to refine his defensive plans. He repositioned some of the 30 caliber machine guns to cover gaps in the beach defenses. He had his Marines dig deeper fighting positions. He pre-registered artillery concentrations for the most likely landing beaches, marking the ranges so gun crews could deliver accurate fire in darkness. He did everything a professional officer could do to prepare for a battle that mathematics said he could not win. The garrison settled into a routine that combined exhausting labor with constant fear. Work during the day, repairing damage from the latest air raid and improving fortifications. Stand, watch at night, scanning the ocean for signs of approaching ships. Eat when possible, sleep when exhausted. Wait for the attack that intelligence said was coming and hope that reinforcements would arrive from Pearl Harbor before the Japanese landing force appeared on the horizon. On the evening of December 10th, Coast watchers reported Japanese naval forces departing Roe in the Marshall Islands. The composition of the force was unclear, but intelligence estimated at least 3 cruisers, 6 destroyers, and troop transports carrying hundreds of Special Naval Landing Force troops, the Japanese equivalent of Marines, elite infantry, trained specifically for amphibious operations. Devereux called his battery commanders together and reviewed the fire plan one final time. Wait until the Japanese are within range. Make every shot count. Do not waste ammunition on ranging fire or targets that are too far away to hit reliably. Trust the mathematics and trust your training. The battery commanders asked the question that every officer asks before battle. What if we cannot stop them? What if they land despite our fires? What if there are more of them than intelligence estimates? Devereux gave the only answer that made sense. Then we fight them on the beaches. And if they get past the beaches, we fight them in the interior. And if they overwhelm the interior positions, we make them pay for every yard until we run out of ammunition or men. There is no fallback position. There is no reinforcement. There is only this island and what we can do to defend it. The Marines returned to their positions and waited for dawn. 4:50 a.m. December 11th, 1941. The southern horizon began to show the first grey hints of approaching dawn. Marine lookouts on Peacock Point spotted shapes moving against the darkness. Multiple ships, closing on Wake Island from the south. Devereux received the reports in his command post and checked the pre-arranged fire plans one final time. Battery A would engage the leading ships first. Battery L would hold fire until targets entered their arc of coverage. Battery B would remain ready to engage any ships that attempted to circle around to the northern approaches. The Marines would not fire until ordered. They would wait until the Japanese were well within effective range, and then they would demonstrate what obsolete guns could do when properly aimed. Rear Admiral Sadamichi Kajioka commanded the Japanese Wake invasion force from his flagship, the light cruiser Yubari. His task force included the cruisers Tenryu and Tatsuta, the destroyers Oite, Hayate, Mutsuki, Kisaragi, Yayoi, and Mochizuki, 2 converted destroyer transports designated Patrol Boat 32 and Patrol Boat 33, and the armed merchant cruisers Kongo Maru and Kinryu Maru. The transports carried 450 Special Naval Landing Force troops, elite infantry who had trained for exactly this kind of operation. Kajioka's intelligence indicated that Wake was lightly defended. Aerial reconnaissance had reported limited activity around the Marine positions. The daily bombing raids had apparently destroyed most of the American defensive capability. The landing should be routine. Naval bombardment to suppress any remaining resistance, troops ashore before dawn, consolidation by mid-morning. Another American outpost captured, another step in the advance across the Pacific. What Kajioka did not know was that Devereux had ordered his Marines to minimize visible activity during daylight hours. The gun positions had been camouflaged. Crews stayed under cover except when absolutely necessary. To Japanese observers flying overhead at 15,000 feet, Wake appeared to be nearly abandoned, its defenses shattered by days of bombing. At 5 a.m., the Japanese warships began their approach runs. Yubari led the column, followed by the destroyers in formation. They steamed parallel to the southern shore of Wake Island at approximately 8,000 yards range, close enough to conduct effective bombardment, but still outside what Japanese intelligence believed to be the maximum effective range of the American coastal guns. The cruisers and destroyers opened fire at 6 a.m., their shells arcing over the coral reef to detonate in the interior of Wake Island. The bombardment was methodical and professional, each ship engaging pre-designated targets. The Japanese gunners aimed for suspected gun positions, command posts, and ammunition storage areas. The shells landed with impressive accuracy, demonstrating that Kajioka's force had done its homework and knew where American facilities were located. Inside Battery A's command post on Peacock Point, Lieutenant Barninger watched the Japanese ships through his optical sight and calculated firing solutions. Yubari was at 8,000 yards, moving west at approximately 15 knots. The mathematics were straightforward. At 8,000 yards, the 5-inch guns could reach the cruiser, but accuracy would be poor. Better to wait until the range decreased to 5,000 yards or less. Devereux's voice came through the field telephone. "Do not fire. Wait for my order." Barninger relayed the command to his gun crews. Crouched in their open emplacements, Japanese shells landing around them, watching enemy warships steam across their front, and held their fire. The psychological pressure was enormous. They were trained to shoot back when being shot at. Every instinct screamed to return fire, to do something, to not just sit and take casualties without fighting back. But they held their fire because Devereux had explained the mathematics, and they trusted the mathematics more than their instincts. The Japanese warships completed their first pass and turned to make another run. This time they closed the range slightly, moving to 7,000 yards. More shells landed across Wake Island. A near miss showered Battery A with coral fragments. One Marine was wounded by shrapnel, but the guns remained operational. 6:30 a.m. The Japanese destroyers Hayate and Oite detached from the main formation and steamed directly toward Wilkes Island, clearly preparing to support a landing operation. They closed, to 4,000 yards, well within effective range of Battery L's 5-inch guns. Lieutenant McAllister tracked Hayate through his optical sight and calculated the firing solution. Range 4,500 yards. Target speed 15 knots. Course parallel to shore. Elevation angle calculated. Azimuth set. Both guns loaded and ready. The field telephone crackled. Devereux's voice: "All batteries, stand by. Do not fire until I give the command." The Japanese ships continued closing. 4,000 yards, 3,500 yards, 3,000 yards. Close enough now that the Marines could see individual sailors moving on the decks. Close enough to read the ship numbers painted on the bows. Close enough that missing would require spectacular incompetence. 6:50 a.m. Devereux gave the order that transformed the Battle of Wake Island from a Japanese landing operation into something neither side had anticipated. Commence firing. Battery A opened fire on Yubari at 6,000 yards. The first salvo was a ranging shot, one gun firing to observe the fall of shot while the second gun waited to adjust. The shell landed 50 yards short, throwing up a geyser of water near the cruiser's bow. Barninger corrected elevation and fired both guns together. The second salvo straddled Yubari, one shell landing long, and one shell hitting the cruiser's superstructure with a direct hit. The Japanese cruiser had been steaming confidently parallel to the shore, its commander apparently unaware that the Americans possessed operational coastal guns. The direct hit was completely unexpected. Yubari turned sharply away from shore, increasing speed and beginning to zigzag to throw off American fire control. Battery A continued firing, achieving multiple hits on Yubari. The cruiser's superstructure was damaged. Her radio antenna was shot away. She took at least 11 direct hits from the 5-inch guns, none of them fatal, but all of them demonstrating that the Marines were far from defeated. On Wilkes Island, Battery L engaged the destroyer Hayate at point-blank range. McAllister had waited until the Japanese ship was at 4,000 yards, close enough that even basic fire control could achieve hits. His first salvo missed, landing just ahead of the destroyer's bow. His gun crews reloaded with practiced efficiency, adjusted elevation, and fired again. The second salvo hit Hayate directly in her magazines. The destroyer exploded in a massive fireball, her ammunition cooking off in a series of secondary explosions that tore the ship in half. Within 2 minutes, Hayate had disappeared beneath the surface, taking most of her crew of 148 men with her. Only one sailor survived. Hayate had the distinction of being the first Japanese surface warship sunk in World War II. Her destruction was witnessed by Marines all across Wake Island, and the sight of a Japanese destroyer literally blowing apart demonstrated that the 5-inch guns were far more effective than anyone had anticipated. Battery L shifted fire to the destroyer Oite, scoring 2 direct hits that damaged but did not sink the ship. Oite turned away sharply, laying smoke to conceal her retreat. The other Japanese destroyers began taking evasive action, zigzagging and increasing speed to make themselves harder targets. Kajioka watched his carefully planned invasion operation disintegrate in real time. His flagship had been hit multiple times. One of his destroyers had been sunk. His other destroyers were taking hits and breaking formation. The Americans were not defeated. They were fighting back with unexpected effectiveness. Worse, his troop transports were still miles offshore, too far away to land under the covering fire that the naval bombardment was supposed to provide. At 7:10 a.m., Kajioka made the decision that would define the battle. He ordered general withdrawal. The invasion force turned away from Wake Island and began retiring toward the southeast. The first Japanese amphibious assault of the Pacific War had been repulsed by shore batteries firing obsolete guns. But the battle was not over. VMF 211's 4 operational Wildcats had been circling above Wake at 12,000 feet, waiting for Japanese bombers that never appeared. When the naval bombardment began, Major Putnam had kept the fighters at altitude, preserving them for the expected air support that would accompany the landing operation. Now, with the Japanese fleet retiring, Putnam radioed his pilots with new orders. "It looks as if there are no Japanese aircraft. Let us go down and join the party." The 4 Wildcats dove toward the retreating ships and began the most improvised attack mission in marine aviation history. The F-4F Wildcat was designed as a fighter aircraft, not a dive bomber or torpedo plane. It carried no bombs as standard armament. But the Marine ground crews on Wake had jury-rigged bomb racks under the wings of each aircraft, allowing them to carry 2 100-pound bombs. 100-pound bombs were not designed to sink warships. They were anti-personnel weapons, meant for use against ground targets like trucks and gun positions. But they were the only bombs the Marines had, and 4 Wildcats carrying 8 bombs total were better than no air attack at all. Captain Henry Hammering Hank Elrod led the attack. He was 26 years old, one of the most experienced pilots in VMF 211, and utterly fearless in combat. He had shot down 2 Japanese bombers during the air raids on December 10th, demonstrating that he could fight even when outnumbered. Now he was attacking warships with weapons that should not have been capable of sinking them. The Wildcats attacked in sequence, each pilot making individual bombing runs rather than coordinated strikes. They dove through anti-aircraft fire that filled the sky with tracers and exploding shells. They released their bombs at low altitude to ensure accuracy, then pulled out of their dives just above wavetop level, while Japanese gunners tracked them with machine guns and light cannon. Elrod's target was the destroyer Kisaragi, already damaged and struggling to keep up with the retiring fleet. He dove through the defensive fire, released both bombs, and watched them fall toward the ship's stern. One bomb missed. The other bomb hit Kisaragi directly on her depth charge racks. The explosion was spectacular. Kisaragi's depth charges detonated in a massive secondary explosion that lifted the destroyer's stern out of the water. The ship broke in 2 and sank within minutes, taking all hands with her. There were no survivors from Kisaragi's crew. Captain Elrod had just achieved the first sinking of an enemy warship by a fighter aircraft in World War II. He had done it with a 100-pound bomb that no one had expected to be capable of inflicting fatal damage on a destroyer. The other Wildcat pilots continued their attacks, strafing the retiring ships with 50-caliber machine gun fire and dropping their remaining bombs. They damaged several ships, but achieved no additional sinkings. After 9 consecutive sorties, the Wildcats returned to Wake, their pilots exhausted and their aircraft riddled with damage from Japanese anti-aircraft fire. By 7:40 a.m., the Battle of December 11th was over. The Japanese Wake invasion force had withdrawn, leaving behind 2 destroyers sunk, 1 cruiser heavily damaged, and more than 300 dead. American casualties were 4 wounded Marines, no deaths, and 2 Wildcats damaged but repairable. The Marines on Wake could hardly believe what they had accomplished. They had repulsed a Japanese amphibious assault. They had sunk warships with shore batteries. They had proven that determination and accurate gunnery could overcome numerical superiority. For one morning, against all odds and all expectations, they had won. The news electrified America. Pearl Harbor had been a disaster. The Philippines were being overrun. Hong Kong was falling. Singapore was threatened. Everywhere in the Pacific, American and Allied forces were retreating or surrendering, except at Wake Island, where 449 Marines had turned back the Japanese Navy. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. President Franklin Roosevelt addressed the nation on December 12th and praised the Wake garrison as doing a perfectly magnificent job. Newspapers ran headlines celebrating the victory. Radio commentators described the battle in detail, emphasizing how outnumbered the Marines were and how effectively they had fought. The phrase, "Send us more Japs," was attributed to Commander Cunningham, though in reality he had sent a long list of critical equipment needs that some enterprising journalist had transformed into defiant propaganda. For a nation reeling from Pearl Harbor and desperate for good news, Wake Island became a symbol of American determination. The garrison became heroes. Their defiance became inspiration. The mathematics of shore defense that had turned back the Japanese fleet became proof that America could fight back, could win, could survive. But on Wake itself, the Marines understood that December 11th had been a tactical victory that changed nothing strategically. The Japanese would return. Next time they would bring more ships, more troops, more firepower. The garrison had bought time, but time alone would not save them unless reinforcements arrived from Pearl Harbor. The daily air raids continued. Japanese bombers returned on December 12th, 13, 14, and every day thereafter. They flew higher now, staying above 15,000 feet, where the 3-inch anti-aircraft guns could barely reach them. They dropped their bombs with less accuracy but greater caution, having learned that Wake's defenders were far from defeated. VMF 211 continued flying patrols, but attrition was grinding down the squadron. One Wildcat was shot down on December 22nd. Another crashed on landing after taking battle damage. By December 22nd, the squadron was down to 2 operational aircraft, and those 2 were held together by improvised repairs and salvaged parts. The Marines on Wake waited for help that they knew was coming, but that never seemed to arrive. Task Force 14, built around the carrier Saratoga, had departed Pearl Harbor on December 16th with reinforcements, supplies, and additional aircraft for the garrison, but the task force moved slowly, hampered by fueling requirements and by Admiral Frank Fletcher's excessive caution. Fletcher knew that Japanese carriers were operating somewhere in the Pacific. He knew that risking Saratoga might cost the Navy its only operational carrier in the Pacific. He moved carefully, refueling his destroyers multiple times, advancing at a speed that would have frustrated more aggressive commanders. By December 22nd, he was still more than 600 miles from Wake, too far away to provide support if the Japanese attacked again, and the Japanese were preparing to attack again. Admiral Kajioka had returned to the Marshall Islands in humiliation after the repulse on December 11th. His superiors were furious that a small Marine garrison had defeated a Japanese naval force. The Imperial Navy's reputation had been damaged. That damage had to be repaired by taking Wake Island regardless of cost. The second invasion force assembled at Kwajalein included most of the ships from the first attempt, repaired and reinforced. But this time, Kajioka received substantial reinforcements: 4 heavy cruisers, Aoba, Kinugasa, Kako, and Furutaka, additional destroyers, more transports carrying 1,500 Special Naval Landing Force troops, more than 3 times the number in the first assault. Most critically, Kajioka received 2 aircraft carriers, Soryu and Hiryu, both veterans of the Pearl Harbor attack. The carriers brought with them more than 100 aircraft, including Zero fighters that would sweep the skies clean of any American resistance. Wake's 400 Marines were about to face an invasion force, supported by the same naval air power that had devastated Pearl Harbor 15 days earlier. The carrier aircraft struck Wake on December 21st and 22nd, destroying the last two operational Wildcats and eliminating what remained of Marine air power. The pilots of VMF 211, now grounded, took up rifles and joined the ground defences. Captain Elrod, the man who had sunk Kisaragi with a 100-pound bomb, would fight the final battle as a rifleman. At 2 a.m., on December 23rd, the Japanese landing force approached Wake under cover of darkness. Kajioka had learned from his first attempt. This time, there would be no preliminary bombardment to warn the defenders. This time, the assault would go straight to the beaches, accepting casualties from shore batteries in exchange for getting troops ashore quickly. Two destroyers, deliberately run aground as improvised landing craft, disgorged Special Naval Landing Force troops directly onto the southern beaches. Other landing craft approached from multiple directions simultaneously, splitting the marine defences. 900 Japanese troops came ashore in the first wave, supported by naval gunfire from ships standing offshore. The Marines fought as Devereux had trained them to fight. The coastal guns engaged the offshore ships, sinking Patrol Boat 32 and Patrol Boat 33. The machine guns swept the beaches with interlocking fires. The riflemen held their positions and killed Japanese troops as they tried to advance inland. But there were too many attackers coming from too many directions. Japanese troops infiltrated past the beach defences and attacked the airfield. Captain Elrod rallied a group of Marines and civilian volunteers to defend the aviation facilities. He moved from position to position under heavy fire, organising counterattacks and directing defensive fires. He was killed leading a charge against Japanese troops who had captured one of the American machine gun positions. He would be awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously for his actions during the battle. On Wilkes Island, Captain Wesley Platt led a savage counterattack that wiped out an entire Japanese company that had landed on the western beaches. The fighting was brutal hand-to-hand combat, Marines and civilians using rifles, grenades and bayonets to clear Japanese positions. Platt's counterattack killed more than 90 Japanese troops and drove the survivors back to their landing beaches. But the victory on Wilkes did not change the larger tactical situation. The Japanese controlled Wake Island proper, and more enemy troops were landing every hour. By dawn on December 23rd, more than 1,000 Japanese troops were ashore and advancing against Marine positions that were running low on ammunition. Communications had broken down as Japanese troops cut field telephone wires. Devereux had lost contact with most of his outlying positions and did not know whether they had been overrun or were still fighting. Commander Cunningham made the hardest decision any commander ever makes. He knew that Task Force 14 had been recalled on December 22nd, turned back by Admiral William Pye, who had decided that risking a carrier to relieve Wake was not worth the potential cost. No help was coming. The garrison was surrounded, outnumbered, and out of ammunition. Continuing to fight would only produce more casualties without changing the outcome. At 1300 hours on December 23rd, Cunningham ordered Devereux to surrender the island. Devereux personally went to each remaining position to ensure that his Marines obeyed the order. Some of them had to be convinced at gunpoint to put down their weapons. They had fought for 16 days. They had sunk 4 Japanese warships. They had killed more than 700 enemy troops. They did not want to surrender, but they did surrender, because military discipline required it, and because their commander had determined that further resistance was futile. 433 American military personnel and 1,104 civilians became prisoners of war. They would spend the next 3.5 years in Japanese prison camps, enduring conditions that would kill many of them. The Japanese held Wake Island until September 4th, 1945, when the garrison surrendered to American forces after Japan's overall surrender. During that time, on October 5th, 1943, the Japanese executed 98 American civilian prisoners who had been kept on Wake as slave labor. They were machine-gunned in groups, their bodies dumped into unmarked graves. One prisoner escaped the massacre and carved a message into coral rock. 98 USPW, the 10th of May 2043. The inscription remains visible today, a memorial to men who survived the battle only to be murdered 2 years later. The mathematics of Wake Island's defense were stark and simple. 449 Marines and sailors, supported by civilian volunteers, held an indefensible position against an enemy that controlled the surrounding ocean and sky. They held for 16 days. They inflicted casualties at a ratio of 5-1. They sank 4 Japanese warships and damaged several others. They shot down or damaged 28 enemy aircraft. They demonstrated that American forces could fight, could win tactical victories, could make the Japanese pay for their conquests. The strategic impact of Wake Island extended far beyond the 16 days of fighting. The battle proved that Japanese amphibious operations were not invincible. It demonstrated that well-trained troops with obsolete weapons could defeat superior forces through superior gunnery and tactical discipline. It showed the American public that resistance was possible, and that their military could fight back even in the darkest days of the war. Major Devereux would spend the war in Japanese prison camps and emerge in September 1945 to find himself famous. The Marines who had despised him in October 1941 now spoke of him with respect, crediting his harsh training and meticulous planning with saving their lives and allowing them to fight as effectively as they did. The 5-inch guns that held fire until Japanese ships were at point-blank range would become legendary in Marine Corps history. The tactical principle they demonstrated was simple. Sometimes you let the enemy get close, not because you are weak, but because you are waiting for the mathematics to favor you. Sometimes holding fire requires more courage than shooting. Sometimes discipline matters more than firepower. The Wake Island device, a special decoration attached to campaign medals, was created to honor those who fought in the battle. It is the only such device in American military history created for a single engagement, recognizing that what happened on Wake was unique and deserving of permanent commemoration. Captain Henry Elrod's sacrifice earned him the Medal of Honor, the first Marine aviator to receive the decoration in World War II. The citation praised his skill as a pilot, his courage in attacking warships with inadequate weapons, and his leadership during the final ground battle. He died at age 26, having accomplished more in 16 days than most officers achieve in entire careers. The mathematical lesson of Wake Island was taught to Marine officers for decades afterward. Position, preparation, and discipline can overcome numerical inferiority. Let the enemy close if closing gives you the advantage. Make every shot count. Trust your training more than your instincts. Win the battles you can win, and when you cannot win, make the enemy pay such a price that your defeat matters as much as their victory. 411 Marines let 5,000 Japanese surround Wake Island. They sank 2 destroyers before they surrendered. They demonstrated that the war would not be won by Japanese simply because they struck first and struck hard. They proved that Americans would fight, and in fighting would learn how to win. The age of American naval dominance in the Pacific began with a defeat on a tiny coral atoll that nobody had heard of before December 8, 1941. It began with Marines who held their fire until the enemy was at 4,000 yards. It began with obsolete guns that sank modern warships. It began with men who did the mathematics and trusted the mathematics, even when every instinct told them to fire. Wake Island fell, but in falling, it taught lessons that would shape how America fought the rest of the Pacific War. Sometimes the most important victories are the ones that never show up in the history books as victories at all. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and do not forget to subscribe.